Xin chào buổi sáng tất cả mọi người. Hôm nay thì mình sẽ bắt đầu trở lại quá trình ghi lại cả quá trình học của mình về JavaScript. Thực ra thì trong khoảng thời gian vừa rồi mình cũng đã tự học khá là nhiều trong cái course này. Hôm nay cũng khá là lười, mỗi ngày mình chỉ học được khoảng 30 phút. Hôm nay thì mình sẽ tiếp tục học. Mình sẽ bỏ qua cái phần coding challenge vì buổi sáng thì mình muốn ngồi học cái gì mới hơn là ngồi làm bài tập, cho nên là mình sẽ bắt đầu học từ cái bài 46 iteration for loop. Bắt đầu học nhé.
And also that there are more control structures, right? Well, one of the other control structures are loop. And so loops are our final big topic in this JavaScript fundamentals section. So loops are a fundamental aspect of every programming language because they basically allow us to automate repetitive tasks. So tasks that we have to perform over and over again. And here I like to use the analogy of a gym. So when you go to a gym, you might, for example, lift weights, right? And let's say that you do 10 repetitions of a certain weightlifting exercise. So we could represent that by doing something like this. So lifting weights repetition 1. And then some more emojis here. Okay, so repetition 1, and remember we want 10 repetitions. So we would have to paste this code here 10 times, and I don't know even if this are 10 times or not, but anyway, you can start to guess that this is probably not a best practice. Just imagine that we had 30 repetitions instead of just 10. And then if we wanted to, for example, change some word here in this string, then we would have to change that in all of them. So this really violates the don't repeat yourself principle, right? Because we're basically repeating the same code here 10 times, and all we're changing is just this number. So instead of doing all this, we can now create a loop and then put one of these lines of code in there, and the loop will then run that code over and over again until we tell it to stop. And so let's implement a so-called for loop now. And that's a loop which has a counter. So let's do that, and we simply write for and open parentheses. So a little bit like the if statement, and this is a for statement, and so it looks similar. Now the loop statement has 3 parts. The first part is the initial value of a counter. And in the case of this current example, the counter is the value that will start here at number 1 and go all the way to number 10. So let's call this counter rep, which stands for repetition. And so here we literally create a variable called rep. And we start it at 1 because, well, that's our first repetition. Okay? And here we need to use a let variable because this counter will later be updated by the for loop. So that's the first part of the for statement. Then we use semicolon and go to the second part. And the second part is a logical condition that is evaluated before each iteration of the loop. So before each time that the code in the loop is executed. So let me just write it here first, and then this will make more sense. So our condition will be rep needs to stay below or equal 10. So again, this condition that we just described here will be evaluated before each iteration of the loop. Now if the condition is true, then the next loop iteration will run. But as soon as this condition is false, then the loop stops. And so no more code will then be executed. So basically, the loop will keep running while this condition stays true. And this is really important to realize, and let me actually write that down here for you. So for loop keeps running while condition is true. So this is the kind of notes that I hope that you are taking throughout the course, but this one is really important, and so I wanted to write it down. Okay, and so now I hope it makes sense that we have this condition, because in each iteration of the loop, the rep counter will get increased. And so at a certain point, it will reach 10, and with 10, this condition is still true. So 10 is still less or equal than 10. But then, after that, it will be 11. And so then, repetition is no longer less or equal 11, and then the loop will stop. And at that point, we will have printed these 10 strings, basically. So let's continue writing this, so that in the end, we actually make that work. So speaking of increasing the counter, that is actually the third part of the for statement. So another semicolon here, and now here we actually update the counter after each iteration. So that's necessary because right now the counter would just stay at 1 forever. And so this condition here would never be false. So what we do here is to now increase the counter by 1 after each iteration. So we can say rep equal rep plus 1. But does this look familiar to you? So basically increasing the value by just 1. Remember that in the last section we actually learned about a special operator which does just this, but in a much simpler way. So instead of writing rep equal rep plus 1, we can simply write rep plus plus. And so this will take the rep value and increase it by 1. Alright, and now all we have to do is to write the code that we want to be repeated. And so let's copy this string here. Okay, and let's say 1, and then it will print this string 10 times. So let's start with that, and then afterwards I will show you how we can actually update this number here. But for now, let's try this out, and actually let's comment this code out so that it doesn't get in our way. So command / for that, and let's go. And indeed, we see that the string was printed 10 times. That's what this 10 here stands for. So the DevTools will not print the same string 10 times, it will simply put this 10 here. But what matters is that this logic here actually worked. So now let's actually use this counter variable that we created here to actually increase the number in the string that we're printing out. So how do you think we will do that? Well, it's actually simple. All we have to do is to replace this number here with the current value of the counter, because this variable that we defined here, so this rep variable, it's just a normal variable, and it's going to be available here inside of this code block. So let's transform this to a template string so that we can then insert that variable into the string. So we get rid of the hard-coded value, and now we basically dynamically build the string. And so here, all we need to do is to put the rep variable. And now we get exactly what we wrote here manually in the beginning, right? So that works, and so let's recap exactly what we did here. So we wanted to log our string here, so a string like this 10 times. But of course, it could be any other repetitive operation. Again, we're just using console.log here so that we can see the result in the developer console. Anyway, in order to solve this problem of not having to repeat the same code over and over again, we used a for loop. And so we initialized the counter of the loop at 1. So right here, we created this new rep variable, and rep again stands for repetition, but it could be any other variable name, of course. And so we started at 1 because, well, we wanted to start at repetition number 1, but we could also start, of course, at repetition 5. So let's see how that looks like. And then, as you might have expected, the first repetition that we printed is the number 5. Okay, but let's put it back to 1 now. So after each iteration of the loop, we then increase this counter value by exactly 1. And this happens by the end of the iteration. So in the first iteration, this string here is logged to the console with the current repetition, which stands at 1. So this here will be replaced by 1, and then afterwards the rep counter will be updated to 2. Then in the next iteration, this same string here is printed, but now with rep at number 2. Then rep is updated from 2 to 3, and so on and so forth. And these loops keep running while the rep variable is less or equal 10. So basically, while this condition here is true. And that's how we achieve exactly 10 repetitions. So what the loop does is to verify before each repetition if our condition here still holds true. And only if it does, it will keep running the loop. So it will execute the next iteration, and so it will execute this block of code here one more time. And of course, we could change it to something else. Let's put it at 30, and then we should get, indeed, 30 repetitions of the same string where only this counter here is changed. Alright, and in a nutshell, that's how the for loop works in JavaScript. In the next few videos, we will see some more useful applications of the for loop, and also talk about another type of loop that we have in JavaScript. Let's now explore some more features of the for loop and also create a somewhat more useful example. And one of the most used applications of for loops is to loop through arrays. So let's get back the array that we were using before. So where is that? So I mean the one where we talked about objects. Yeah, this one. So go to this lecture about Introduction to Objects and then grab this Jonas array. And maybe you didn't write it back then, but then you can just write it right now. Okay, and so now we can use a for loop to loop through this array. And let's say for now that we wanted to individually log every element of the array to the console. So very simple. All we want to do is to log these 5 elements here. So let's write a for loop, and as always we start with the counter. So and now a traditional counter variable name has been I for a long time, and so let's use that here as well. So just I, and this time we need to start it at 0. And that's because the array is 0 based when it comes to reading elements out of the array. Remember? And this will make sense once we actually write the code of this loop. Let's now actually skip the condition for now, so we're going to deal with that a little bit later. And so now updating the counter is going to work exactly the same as before. So since we want to log all of the elements, we need to update the counter variable simply by 1. And so again we use plus plus. Okay, and now let's write our loop here itself. So console.log, and remember, all we want to log to the console is each element of the array. And so without the loop we would write that like this. So Jonas 0, right? And then let's do that outside. So we would do this, this, and then all the way to number 4. Right? So let's comment this out, but this is helpful to see what kind of code we want to achieve. So again, we want to start at Jonas 0, which is the first element. Jonas 1 is this one, then 2, 3, and 4. And so that's the reason why we started the counter at 0, because that's the first element that we want to get. It's Jonas 0. And so here, instead of hard-coding the 0, of course, we are going to use our counter variable. So, and that's I. And now the trickiest part here is the condition. And so that's why we left it for the end, but now we need to actually tackle it. So, for how long do we want to keep this loop running? Well, it should run when I is 0, right? It should also run when it's 1, 2, 3, and 4, because 4 is the last element. But when it's 5, it should no longer run, right? And that's because Jonas at 5 does not exist. Let's just write that. Does not exist. And so that means that the I counter variable should always stay below 5. So let's write that here. So I should stay below 5. And so with this, as soon as the counter variable is updated to 5, then the next iteration of the loop will not run anymore. So let's try this. And here it's of course not Jonas, it's Jonas array. So let's actually change the name up here in the array itself. Try that again, and yeah, we get a log of each of the elements in the array. So all of the 5 of them. Great. But there's actually still one problem with this, which is that we hard-coded the length of the array here with 5. So let's now say that we add another element, let's say just true, and so if we try this now, do you think that true will be logged here as well?
Mình đã cho chạy cái loop nó không có điểm dừng, nên là nó bị Chrome nó bị lag mất rồi. Phải tắt đi bật lên cho nó không chạy cái kia nữa. Thì lúc nãy là cái loop này của mình đã bỏ qua cái điều kiện này để cho nó chạy. Vì mình nghĩ là khi mà nó chạy hết 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cái này thì nó sẽ dừng lại, nhưng mà vì mình không define, không xác định cái y này nên là nó đã chạy rất là hồn nhiên. Mở cái này nốt 12. Ok. Đây.
Does not exist. And so that means that the I counter variable should always stay below 5. So let's write that here. So I should stay below 5. And so with this, as soon as the counter variable is updated to 5, then the next iteration of the loop will not run anymore. So let's try this. And here it's of course not Jonas, it's Jonas array. So let's actually change the name up here in the array itself. Try that again, and yeah, we get a log of each of the elements in the array. So all of the 5 of them. Great. But there's actually still one problem with this, which is that we hard-coded the length of the array here with 5. So let's now say that we add another element, let's say just true, and so if we try this now, do you think that true will be logged here as well? Well, it will not, because of course we are still telling JavaScript that I should stay below 5. And so it will not print the array at position number 5, which does now exist. So now we do have Jonas at position 5, right? And so the solution to this is to not hard-code the value here, but to compute this value. So basically to get it from JavaScript itself. And how can we get this number? Well, actually this 5 is simply the length of the array, right? Not of this one anymore, but of the original one. So this array has a length of 5. And so 5 is exactly the number that we put here. And so we can simply replace the hard-coded value with a dynamically calculated one. And that's Jonas.length. Remember? So let's try that. And indeed, it still works. And if I now go back to adding something else, like true, then Jonas.length will now be 6. and that of course happens automatically, and we don't have to manually change any code in that loop. So now indeed true also appears here in our log. Great. Let's now also log something else here. Let's say the type of the variable. So type of Jonas I. And I hope that this part here makes sense. So the fact that we're using a counter variable here to retrieve all the elements of the array. So now let's say, so string, string, number, string, object. So remember how I said that an array is in fact an object, and here we have the proof of that. And then finally the last one is of course a boolean. Okay, so I hope that this logic here makes sense. And so this is, in a nutshell, how we loop arrays using the for loop. Now what we did here was only to read values from an array. But now let's also at the same time create a new array which will contain this type of each of the elements. So basically this. Alright? So again, what I want to do now is to create a new array which will contain all the types for all these elements. And if that sounds a little bit useless, then just keep in mind that these are all just educational exercises. So I designed them to show you how these different features of the language work. So in the real world, we would probably not create an array with types of variables. But this is excellent to show you how to create a new array based on the values of one original array. So to do that, we start by creating a new empty array outside of the loop. And let's do that here, after this one. So I will call this one types. And now I think this is something we didn't do before, which is to simply create an empty array. And all we have to do is to basically create an array with the usual syntax, but without any element inside of it. And so now we have to go here to the same loop, because this new array types will be based on the Jonas array. So it's going to have the same length, and so we can use the exact same loop that we used to read data from the Jonas loop, also to construct this new types array. So let's say types at position I should be equal to type of Jonas at position I. And remember that this works because we can essentially do this. So we could do it again without a loop and say types 0 is equals string. So this would work, right? And so of course it also works with the index number here dynamically. And so that's exactly what we're doing here in the exact same way as we read data from the Jonas array. Right? So in iteration 0, we will have type 0 equals type of Jonas 0. Then in the next iteration, we will have types 1 equals type of Jonas 1, and then 2, 3, 4, and 5. Alright? So just to see if that works, let's then log to the console this newly created, or to be more accurate, this newly filled array. So let's see. And indeed, now we get this array, which has exactly the types that you can see here as well. So string number, string, object, and boolean. So these 6 that we also have here, which means that we achieved our goal here. Now this is just one way of filling an array. Let me write that down here. Filling the types array. And here we do basically reading from Jonas array. But this is just one way of doing it. So let's comment out this one and do it in another way. And do you remember how to add elements to an array in another way? Well, we could use the push method, right? So that would be types dot push. And remember that push adds a new element to the end. Of the array. And so here, we now need to pass in the element that we do want to add on to the array. And so that's again type of Jonas at position I. So of the current counter. And so if we try this now again, we should get the same. And it's important that we add the new element to the end of the array and not to the beginning. So we really need to use push here and not unshift. So I think that this way of doing it here is actually a little bit cleaner. But if you prefer this first way here, then of course you can just use that one as well. But what matters here is that you really understood the logic of how to construct all the different parts of this for loop in order to loop the array. So it starts with the counter being 0, because that's the first element of the array. And then this condition here, which specifies that the current index always needs to stay below the length of the array that we're looping through. And then in the loop itself, we always get the current element using the current counter, which is going to go from 0 to the length of the array minus 1, basically. Alright? And to make sure we really get this, let's try another, maybe more practical example. So let's go back to having an array of birth years. So 1991, 2007, let's say, 1969, and 2020. And now what we want to do is to calculate the ages for all these 4 birth years here. And we want to store them in a new array. And that's a very common type of operation, which we actually already did before, but without using loops. So essentially that's what we did in the tip calculator challenge. Here. So here we had an array of 3 belts, and then we manually calculated the tip for each of them. So manually we specified the index 0, 1, and 2, and created a new array based on these values. But in the real world, we would have used a loop to do that. And so that's what we will do now. Okay, just with another bit more simple example. Years is the array which contains the birth years, and now let's create another, and again empty array, which will then hold the ages. And so what we're going to do now is to loop through years, and then fill up these ages array. So, 4, and then once more, let's define the counter at 0 for the same reasons that we did it before, and it's not a problem that this counter variable here has exactly the same name. Then the condition is also going to be the same, and actually the whole loop always kind of looks the same when we loop over an array. So now here the difference is that it's of course years dot length, and then at the end we, as always, increase the counter by 1. And now what we need to do is to calculate the age of the current year. So that's going to be 2037, so as always that's the year that we're currently in, let's say, and then minus the current birth year. So how do we get that? We say years at the current loop position. Okay, so that's nothing new, I hope, now at this point. Okay, so we have this calculation now, and now we want to add it to this new empty array. So we say we want to push it to that array. So we use the push method to do that. So ages dot push, and so this is the value that we want to push into this empty array. And that's actually it. So let's check it out in the console. And here we go. So just to confirm, 2037 minus 1991 is of course 46, and let's just do it with 27 as well, 2007 I mean, and so that's 30, which is this one, and so this array result is correct indeed. So what we essentially did is this. We cannot do operations between simple values and an array. So that I showed you earlier, right? We cannot do 2037 minus the years array. That will just give us not a number. And so here, in this loop, we basically did it individually. So we did the calculation one by one. In each iteration of the loop, we calculated 2037 minus this year, and then added it to the first position in the ages array. Then we did 2037 minus this, and put it at the end of the ages array again. And then the same for this one, and for 2020. Great. So that is a very, very useful and important application of the for loop. And now to finish, let's learn about 2 important statements for loops. And that's the continue and the break statement. Let me just write it here. Continue and break. And let's start with continue. So continue is to exit the current iteration of the loop and continue to the next one. On the other hand, break is used to completely terminate the whole loop. So let's see 2 quick examples for that. And let's go back to actually this first loop that you have here, where we looped this Jonas array. So I'll just copy this, because we already learned how to loop through the array, and now I'm just interested in showing you how continue and break work. So let me delete this and this as well. And now let's say that for some reason we only wanted to print elements to the array that are strings. And the continue statement is perfect for this. Because again, with continue we can exit the current iteration of the loop. So what we can do here is to say, if the type of the current element, so Jonas I, is not a string, then continue. And so that's how we write the continue statement. It's really just this continue keyword. So again, what we want to do here is to only log strings to the console, which means that everything else should basically be skipped. And that's what we do here. So we say if the type of the current element, so that's this one here, so if the type of the current element is not a string, then continue, which again means that the current iteration of the loop is exited, and then the next one starts immediately. So let's just write some other note here to the console just so we know what we're doing here, like only strings, because otherwise the output here is going to start to look a little bit confusing. But anyway, let's test this now. And indeed, we only get strings now. So these 3 are strings, and all the other ones are not strings. So this number, this array, and this boolean, so they will now not get printed, because we basically skipped them. For example, that H number, which is 46 here, so the third element, does have the type number here, right? So it's not a string, and so this here will be true, because of course number is different than string. And so this is true, and so this code here will run. And what continue will do is that it will immediately exit the current iteration. And so this line of code here will not be executed in the current iteration. It will not even be reached. Okay? And now finally, let me just show you how break works. And remember that what break does is to completely terminate the whole loop, so not just the current iteration. So what we want to do now is to log no other elements after we found a number. So essentially, after a number is found, which will be this 46 here, nothing else should be printed. So let's do that, and I will again copy all of this. And so let's say here, break with number. So let's translate the logic that we just set into the code. So as soon as a number is found, we want to break the loop. So our if condition here should be type of Jonas I, so the current element, if it's equal to a number, so now that's number, then break. No. Okay, let's see the result here. And indeed, that's exactly what we wanted. So after the first number is found, which is this 46 here, nothing else is printed. So in this iteration, where the number is found, not even this line of code is printed anymore, and then the loop is terminated completely. Alright, now this might not sound very practical, but believe me, there are some important use cases for continue and break. It's just hard to create some small and isolated code examples to show you just how useful they can be. But anyway, I wanted to let you know that continue and break exist. But the most important takeaway from this lecture is definitely to understand how we can loop through arrays using this kind of logic here. Okay, so this one here is really important that you understand this snippet of code. In this lecture, we're going to do two interesting things. First, we will loop over an array backwards, and then second, we will also create a loop inside another loop. So let's have some more fun with arrays now. And so let's get back our array again here. So the Jonas array, and let's forget about this element here. And so now, as I said in the beginning of this video, let's now loop over this array backwards. So the first element that we want to print is this one, then this, and finally Jonas. So essentially, in the last lecture, we looped from the beginning. So we started with index 0, then 1, all the way to 4, right? But now we want to start at 4. Then we want to go to 3, and all the way to 0, which is going to be the last index. So this one is 4, and this one is 0. And so now we need to create the for loop according to this new information. So basically according to this new methodology. So let's start again with the counter, and we'll name it I again. But now, what should be the initial value of the counter? And we already replied to that question, kind of, so it should be 4. But should we just write the 4 here? No, we shouldn't, right? Because we already learned that hard-coded values like this are not a good idea. So what is 4? Well, 4 is basically just the length of the array, which is 5 minus 1. So that's exactly what we will write here. Jonas.length minus 1. Then the condition, and when do we want the loop to stop? Well, it should stop after the 0. And so the condition we need to write, remember, is telling JavaScript in which condition the loop should keep running. And so basically the loop should keep running as long as the counter is still above 0. So I should be greater or equal, actually, 0. So let's quickly simulate that. So at number 4, which is in the beginning, I is greater equal 0, right? So this condition will be true. And so the next iteration will run. Then we need to decrease the index or the counter. And so let's actually do that as well. And so instead of using I++, which we used before, to increment the value, we use minus minus to decrement, or to decrease the value by 1. And so now we move from 4 to 3. And 3, of course, still is greater equal 0. Then all the way to 0, and so 0 is still greater equal 0. Then the counter gets updated again, and it will be updated to minus 1. And now minus 1 is not greater or equal 0. So this is false, and so the loop will stop. Okay? So I hope that this was not hard. Really, all we have to do is to think when we create these 3 parts here of the for loop. And I hope that you could follow my train of thought here. Now anyway, the rest, of course, is going to work just exactly the same. So we're getting, again, the current element. So let's check that very quickly. And yes, great job, it works. And just to really show it, let's also log the counter variable itself. So first the I, so the counter, and then the array value. And so indeed, this works just as we intended. We start with number 4, just as we have it here. And then we move to 3, 2, 1, 0. And if we now edit one element, then for sure, this is going to work just the same, because now Jonas length is 6, and minus 1 is 5, and so it will start here at true. And indeed, it does. Alright, now you will probably not be doing this all the time in your own code, but I thought that this was a nice exercise, so we could again think about how to define the counter, the condition, and the counter update. Okay, so that was the first part of this lecture, and now I want to show you how we can create a loop inside of a loop. So, does that sound crazy? Well, it's not so crazy. And it's not so difficult either. And to do this, let's go back to our gym example from the first loop lecture. So there we had 10 repetitions for a certain weightlifting exercise, remember? But now, let's say that we have 3 different exercises, and we want to repeat each of them 5 times. So that means a total of 15 repetitions, 5 for each of the 3 exercises. So to log all these exercises, we will need a loop inside a loop. So let's roll up our sleeves and get to work here. And we're going to start with the 3 exercises. So let's create a counter, and I'll actually call it exercise. So exercise, we start at 1 now this time again, because we simply want to log exercise 1, 2, and 3. So our condition here is that the exercise should be less or equal 3. And actually this would be exactly the same as writing exercise below 4. So you can do whatever you prefer most, and I think I will actually stick with this one this time. And then we need to increase the exercise after each iteration as always. So now let's log to the console something like this. Starting exercise, and actually here we want to include the exercise number, so let's instead create a template literal. And so here we use that counter variable. So let's just check this one. So we have 3 exercises, but we don't have any repetitions yet in there. And so now, again, we need to create a loop inside a loop, so that in each exercise we can have the 5 repetitions that we want. And the repetitions themselves are a loop, right? And so that's why we now need that loop inside of this loop. So let's do that. And this is going to be basically the same as we did earlier. So let's again call it rep, start at 1, and then the condition. So remember how I said that we want 5 repetitions this time. And so let's say we want to stay below 6. So again, that would be exactly the same as writing less or equal 5. But let's keep it a bit different this time and say below 6. And then rep plus plus. And now lifting weights repetition. And again, I forgot to make this a template literal. So yes, this should work much better. And now this cute emoji here again. Oh, where is it? And let's test this now. So what do you expect to see? Think about that before you load your own result, or before I load here the result. So, is this what you expected? Let's even increase this here a little bit. And now we see the full picture. Alright, so we start exercise number 1, which is what we have here, and then inside of this iteration of exercise 1, a new loop is created and executed. And so that's what then creates this lifting weights repetition from 1 to 5. Alright, then this loop here is finished, right? So it run all the 5 times, and then this first iteration is finished. And so the exercise loop, so this outer loop here, goes to its second iteration. And so we are at exercise number 2, and then this whole loop here will run again from 1 to 5. So that's these 5 here, and then that loop again finishes, and then the exercise iteration finishes, and we go to iteration number 3. So exercise is now number 3, and then the whole repetition loop, so this inner loop here, will run 5 times again. And with that, we end up with a total of basically 15 repetitions, just as I said in the beginning. So 3 times 5. Okay? And we could even include the number of the current exercise in this string that we're printing here. So let's do that as well. Exercise, and then exercise. So this is the variable that we get from the outer loop. And so this variable here is, of course, available inside this whole loop. And that does include all the inner code, even this inner loop. And so that's why we can access this variable here as well. And so now we should see exercise 1 printed for these 5, then exercise 2 printed for these 5, and exercise 3 for the last ones. And yeah, beautiful. Alright, I think this was a very fun exercise. And again, even though you might not use this all the time in the real world, I still think that this was a pretty cool example to show you some more power of loops. And now to wrap up this section, all there is left to learn is another type of loop, which is the while loop.
Mình sẽ dừng lại ở đây và tiếp tục vào ngày mai. Vì bây giờ mình phải lên phòng thí nghiệm 9 giờ và mình phải đi bộ từ đây lên đấy. Nó sẽ mất khoảng 20 phút, 15 phút để chuẩn bị đi. Bye. Xin chào. Hẹn gặp lại lần sau.